Ecclesiastes chapter 1. As the Lord gives time and opportunity over the next probably several months, and as Pastor Whitmer would give opportunity, I guess, I'd like to start an expositional study through the book of Ecclesiastes. This is a book that has had a big impact on my life, especially in my younger years, and I think it would be a great and I think very helpful and beneficial study for us to go through as a church. Those of you that have read or studied through this book already understand its unique nature, its complexities. It's not an easy book to understand. As you initially start reading through it, and actually a major portion of the introduction, several early chapters, we kind of get this sense, this theme of pessimism by what appears to be a very cynical philosopher or author. And he often refers to, in fact, right at the very beginning of the message, he refers to life as vanity, a vanity of vanities, actually. Kind of a depressing way to start a book, a message, right? And it's a word that we should get familiar with as we study through it because the author uses it 37 times throughout the book. Obviously stating a very current and consistent theme as we go through it. Now, today's message will definitely be an introductory message, a series hopefully laying some groundwork from which we can build on in a future study, hopefully gaining understanding of the book as a whole. Lord willing, we'll give some good time to the book's author tonight, its context, and hopefully its overarching theme, as well as its introductory theme. The title of our message this evening is Despair, Despair, Despair. Kind of a rough way to start a message, right? It will get better, I promise. So let's go ahead and look down at verse 1 of chapter 1 in Ecclesiastes. It says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." I'm going to stop right there. As we begin this study tonight in this introductory message, we're going to spend some time talking about our author, as I want to call him, the despairing preacher. That's point number 1, our despairing preacher. We have a few hints as to who the author is in this book, and some would actually say the jury is still out on who it actually is. It was fairly universally believed that the author was Solomon in the early years. And that would kind of make sense as you read, especially in this first verse here. He says that he is the son of David, the king of Israel. And before that, he actually calls himself a preacher. And that's kind of interesting to me. In the Greek, that is actually the title of our book, Ecclesiastes. That means preacher. Literally meaning one who calls an assembly or one who leads or gathers together an assembly. It's translated preacher or teacher. And then he goes on to refer to himself then as David, the son of David. So that kind of narrows it down for us, right? But there are several sons of David, several kings to follow, so we're not quite sure yet. And we get certain clues from the author throughout the book. In fact, in verse 16 of chapter 1, he speaks of his great wisdom, wisdom far greater than any who ruled before him. Chapter 2, verses 4 through 6, the author describes himself as the builder of great projects. And verse 7 of chapter 2 speaks of his many slaves and his abundance of wealth. And in verse 9, he basically calls himself the greatest king to have ever ruled over Jerusalem. So with all that in mind, all that information, it makes sense to say, okay, this has got to be Solomon. And unfortunately, though, in the 1600s, that kind of came into question. There were some theologians that began to examine the Hebrew, and the Hebrew in Ecclesiastes compared to the proper Hebrew of that time period didn't seem to match up. And so since the 1600s, people began to question whether or not Solomon was actually the author or not. Now, for the sake of our study this evening, we are going to assume that Solomon is the author. And I believe that based on the text and the information given, that is the best and most logical conclusion. And nothing has been disproved on that point yet. So we're going to assume throughout our study that this is Solomon that is talking here. Now, why do I take the time to establish the author of this book? This book is a book of wisdom. Specifically, more even beyond that, it's a book of philosophy. Think of your great philosophers throughout history. You have Aristotle, you have Plato, you have Descartes, John Locke, list goes on. You can name a whole bunch. Books have been written on these men. Biographies have been written on them. Why? Because if we understand who the author is, we can then analyze and study his personal life and better understand the context of which it is he is writing what he believes. And especially in this book of Ecclesiastes, I think it's very helpful to understand our author, who is writing this, where he's coming from. Because he's going to say a lot of startling things in this book, things that don't make sense. And as we understand who our author is, Solomon, I think we'll better understand what his goal is in this book. So what do we know of Solomon, our despairing preacher here in Ecclesiastes? We know him to be the favored son of David, born of his favored wife, Bathsheba. He began his reign at the young age of 18. Some of you juniors and seniors, imagine graduating and moving straight to the presidency of the United States. It's kind of the idea, right? A lot of responsibility on this young 18-year-old. That's when he came to the point of reigning in Jerusalem. So he's crowned king at the age of 18, and in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 5 through 15, I won't ask you to turn to these passages for sake of time, but I'm going to refer to several of them to kind of help get some context here of our author. So in this passage, 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon has just been crowned king, and he is offered by God in this dream basically a blank check. So he receives a dream from God, God saying, Solomon, I will give you whatever you request. I'm going to give you a request. So he basically takes a check out, signs his name to it, and hands it to Solomon and says, whatever you want, you put it on there, and it's going to be yours. Pretty awesome, I think, right? So what does he ask for? In verse 9 of 1 Kings 3, we know the story well. Solomon says, give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this thy so great a people? I find that an amazing request right there from an 18-year-old boy. I wish I would have said the same when I was back an 18-year-old, but I probably wouldn't. There's probably all sorts of things, money, a few inches taller, whatever, You have a whole bunch of stuff. Everybody has their own things back in that day they would have valued and wished for, right? But Solomon starts out and he says, he evaluates where he's at. He evaluates his position and says, God, I want wisdom. I want understanding, because who can rule over these people? Who can rule with knowledge over these people the way I am right now? I can't do it. So he, in his already young wisdom as a child, as a teen, he asks God for ultimate wisdom, for ultimate knowledge. And God was pleased and granted his request and provided Solomon a wise and understanding heart. So he begins his reign with a ton of opportunity, a ton of potential. He starts it out right. He seeks God. He asks God for a wise request, asking for wisdom. A great start, a lot of potential. But as we'll later see, that opportunity and potential does not actually guarantee spiritual success. In chapter 4 of 1 Kings, verse 29, it says, and Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. And his fame was in all nations round about, and there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. So he gains wisdom. God grants him wisdom, and he is famous. Everyone knows who Solomon is. His name goes beyond the reaches of the country. People come from all over the place to hear the words of the great Solomon. He has great wisdom. Wisest man, wisest king to ever rule. He also had much power and success. In chapter 4 of 1 Kings, verse 21, it says that Solomon reigned over all kingdoms, from the river unto the land of the Philistines, unto the border of Egypt. He built an empire, is what he did. At the height of his power, reigning over virtually the entire known world. This was considered the golden age of Israel. Greatest nation in the world. He had amazing power. He had amazing success, no doubt as a result of his amazing wisdom. He was a great engineer and builder. His greatest achievement was obviously the temple, but he did far more beyond that. He also built what is called the Hall of Judgment. He built himself a house that took him 13 years to build. Imagine waiting 13 years for your house. He built a house for Pharaoh's daughter, a fortress to protect the temple. Numerous defensive structures and cities. He invented the Solomonic gates. They're kind of interesting to study. It's a series of kind of zigzag mazes that came before the gate, which made the gates of Israel or Jerusalem pretty much impenetrable. He designed that. He was an amazing engineer and builder. Solomon also possessed great riches. In 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 26, it says, and Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. I want you to remember this, okay? This point right here we're going to come back to. He had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Verse 27 says they lacked nothing. In 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 14, it says, now the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. Beside that, he had of the merchantmen and of the traffic of the spice merchants, and of all the kings of Arabia, and of the governors of the country. And King Solomon made 200 targets of beaten gold. 600 shekels of gold went to one target. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold. 3 pounds of gold went to one shield. It's amazing. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. And it goes on to describe these amazing thrones that he built, thrones of ivory overlaid with gold. He had wealth beyond compare. Solomon had everything. None more successful than him. There's no denying that. No king ever greater than Solomon. So you tell me, how does a man as great as Solomon, as wise as Solomon, as rich as Solomon, as powerful as Solomon come to write a book like Ecclesiastes? A book of despair, seemingly, as we begin. The despairing preacher. I think we find our answer over in Deuteronomy chapter 17, if you would turn there with me. Deuteronomy chapter 17. This is an interesting passage right here. God is writing to Moses, actually. And in God's wisdom, infinite wisdom and knowledge, he knew that one day Israel would ask for a king. And so in his knowledge, he looks down to Moses and says, Moses, listen, Israel one day is going to ask for a king. So here's what I want. I want you to write down these requirements for the kings of Israel. So Moses writes down all of these requirements that God lists as qualifications for kings, the future kings of Israel, years before. I want you to look specifically at verse 16 of Deuteronomy 17. It says, but he shall not multiply horses to himself. I'm going to pause right there. Remember that passage that we looked at a while back, just a few minutes ago? Where Solomon built how many stalls for his horses? 40,000. He didn't multiply. It doesn't sound like he obeyed this commandment very well, did he? Continue reading here. Nor cause the people to return to Egypt to the end that should multiply horses. Again, he says it. For as much as the Lord has said unto you, ye shall henceforth return no more that way. Verse 17. Neither shall he multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Neither shall he greatly multiply to himself silver and gold. These are requirements that were written years before by Moses, commands from God. What's the problem? He's defining exactly what Solomon did. Everything. He multiplied unto himself horses. He multiplied unto himself gold and silver. He multiplied unto himself women. He was enamored with pleasure, pleasure of wealth, pleasure of power, pleasure of immorality. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines, 1,000 women. Good grief. 1,000 women. Crazy. On lots of different levels, actually. He multiplied unto himself wives. And I want to look at 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 6. Don't have to bother to turn there right now. I'm just going to read it. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 6 says, and Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as did David his father. Then did Solomon build an high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And likewise did he for his strange wives, which burn incense and sacrifice unto their gods. What happened? Exactly what God predicted back in Deuteronomy. Why did God not want them to multiply these things unto themselves? God in his wisdom knew that the only thing it would accomplish is distracting that king, and ultimately distracting that nation from their God. So Solomon basically breaks the majority of God's rules for the future kings of Israel. He multiplies unto himself all these things. He became enamored with pleasure, so much so that it had blinded him to what he knew was true and right. There's no doubt Solomon knew these writings. He had to have. Yet he ignored them. He disobeyed them. In his wisdom, he was successful, no doubt. But in that, he also became prideful and rebelled against God. So here he is, our author, the king who had everything, yet was hopelessly lost in despair as he writes this book. The despairing preacher. So we revealed the story of our preacher, Solomon, and with the remainder of the message, I want to touch on the actual theme here. First, the initial theme, and then the broader sense of the theme of the book. Number 2, we're going to see what I'm calling despair's theme. Despair's theme. Most likely towards the end of Solomon's life, he writes the extremely cynical words that we find here in verses 2 and 3. And these are his reflections on life, his summation of his experience in this world. It's not a pleasant account, but rather an account written with feeling of complete and utter anxiety. Look at verse 2 of Ecclesiastes chapter 1. He says, "Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." So here we are, not even into the second verse, and he's already used up 5 of his 37 uses of vanity. What do you think? Is he trying to make a point here? Yeah, obviously. We could safely say Solomon is not in his happy place as he begins this. So he looks out at the crowd he's speaking to and says, "Your life, my life, it's a waste." Now I want to take a moment here, a little pause, and I want to talk about the people that he's speaking to in this passage. I think it's important as we understand where he's coming from and what is actually in the book. Naturally, we might assume that Solomon is speaking primarily to Israel. That makes sense. That's the majority of the audience of the book, the Old Testament. So that's kind of what we assume. But while Israelites were certainly part of the audience, I don't believe that was Solomon's primary target group, people he was speaking to. Many commentators define the book of Ecclesiastes as a cultural apologetic. Now, what is a cultural apologetic? We know apologetic is a defense of a belief, right? And it was popular back then in this time period for wise men such as Solomon, and Solomon being the wisest of men, of course, will be very much a part of this. It was popular back then for wise men all over the world to gather together and to argue their points on philosophy of life, gods, religion, whatever. And they would gather together and they would discuss these things. And this was very popular, and no doubt this was something that Solomon was very much participating in throughout his life. So more than likely, sitting before him as he preaches, as he teaches this, there are probably many unsaved philosophers at his feet listening. Even beyond that, the amount of non-Jews or Gentiles that were in Jerusalem at this time was probably more than there had ever been. Think about it. We talked about Solomon making Jerusalem into a trade capital of the world. Merchants from everywhere were coming in, people coming in from all over the world to trade there. Think of his wives alone, most of which were probably political marriages, whatever, bringing in them and then along with their entourages. Jerusalem probably had a ton of Gentiles at this time. So unsaved philosophers and Gentiles were probably a major portion of his audience here. Specifically in chapters 11 and 12 of Solomon, he seems to be addressing a young man in particular here. And as we get further into the series, we'll certainly be looking at that in more detail. But it appears that he's addressing philosophers, and specifically at points he is addressing a young philosopher, a young man. Doesn't say who that is. Perchance it's probably an unsaved young man, young philosopher. So without a doubt, there was a large amount of Gentiles within Jerusalem at this time. And as we study through the book, you may wonder, as many have done already, as to the absence of Hebrew and Jewish words, phrasing, various elements that seem to be in the rest of the Old Testament, but not here in Ecclesiastes. And many believe that's why. His audience is a little bit different than usual, probably an unsaved audience. So Solomon looks down here at the crowd of people, a mix of some Jews, many Gentiles, and philosophers, probably sitting at the edge of their seat, waiting for him to speak. This is the greatest man, the wisest man that has ever lived. Imagine sitting before him in a conference room, whatever they sat in back then, and listening and anticipating the words of Solomon. He starts it out with a real bang. He looks at them and says, "Life is nothing but a vapor." We see Solomon's realization that he has lived his life chasing smoke. I spent my years seeking wisdom, gathering riches, building an empire, chasing and finding every single pleasure I could possibly imagine. And it's all vanity. You can imagine the confusion on their minds as they're watching this man, as they're looking around him and thinking, good grief, look at what you've done. You've made an empire. And at a young age, you've been extremely successful. Everything you touch turns to gold, it seems. How in the world is this man saying that life is a waste? Undoubtedly, they're confused here. Now, our tendency as we begin this study, based on what we already know, what we've seen so far, is to assume that the theme, the overarching theme of Ecclesiastes, is that of despair. And certainly that is a point here at the very beginning. This chapter, early chapters here, are focusing on the despair of life in general and how it is a waste. But I don't want to leave it there. I don't want to just end there tonight and leave no hope for you all. So I want to give you a little bit of a picture of the overall theme of the book. I don't believe Solomon's ultimate goal was to share the pessimistic, cynical musings of an old, washed-up, depressed philosopher and king. I think he has another ultimate goal in mind. It's interesting to note that the book of Ecclesiastes was actually read on the third day of the Feast of Tabernacles. The Feast of Tabernacles was a point of joy for the Jewish people. And on the third day, they would read through the book of Ecclesiastes in this time of joy, specifically emphasizing the joy over man's place in God's creation. That's interesting, right? How does a book like Ecclesiastes find its way into a joyful time? There's a purpose for that. As you read through the book of Ecclesiastes, you will actually come across the word joy and rejoice several times. Sometimes it seems hidden by the amount of depressing things that he has to say. But there is an underlying current here, a theme that he is directing these people towards the end. And it becomes much clearer at the end of the book, in chapters 11 and 12 especially. And in fact, I want you to turn over to chapter 12 with me. Chapter 12 and verse 9 of Ecclesiastes. I want to catch a glimpse here at what Solomon's ultimate goal is as he preaches, as he teaches this book of Ecclesiastes to those sitting in front of him at this time. Chapter 12, verse 9 says, "And moreover, because the preacher, Solomon, was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs." His desire was not simply to vent frustration, that's exactly what it seems like right now, right? He's just venting his frustration at life. That is not his ultimate goal. His ultimate goal here was to teach his listeners, to truly impart wisdom and knowledge to them. And what is that wisdom? At verse 13, at the end of verse 13, we're kind of tipping the key here on the theme, but I think it's important for us to see this and see where we're going in this study. The key here, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. That's where he ends. That's where we're headed. I say that to give you guys some encouragement. So we kind of bear through this cynical introduction, the cynical introductory chapters in the series to come. But Solomon will contrast that with a message of hope. in his later chapters. Now turn back to chapter 1 with me. So far, we've seen our despairing preacher. We've seen the theme here, starting out with the depravity of the world, the nature of everything around us as it will pass away. And then we've seen how the overarching theme, where he is going eventually, is a message of hope. We have something to look forward to. Here in verse 3 is what I'm calling despair's thesis statement. So we've seen the author, we've seen the themes. Finally, I want to see here in verse 3 Solomon's thesis statement. Now, if any of my past English teachers were in the grave right now, they'd roll over. I don't wish that they were. I did probably at one time or another, but this is not, technically speaking, according to the English department, a thesis statement. For it to be a statement, it would have to be an actual statement and not a question. I want you, though, to look down with me and read here in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, or verse 3, excuse me. Excuse me, I have the wrong verse actually written down there. I had there myself. Ecclesiastes 1 verse 3 says, "What profit hath a man of all his labor, which he taketh under the sun?" Okay, so he asked this question here. We're calling it a thesis statement, though it is a question. And we'll give the Solomon the benefit of the doubt here. He didn't take English 102 with me, so he obviously didn't know the rules of a thesis statement. But Solomon's leading out with this, okay? He looks out to the crowd and says, "What profit is our labor under this sun?" It's a rhetorical question that demands a negative answer. You can imagine as people are out there listening to him, what they're thinking. They're probably trying to answer it honestly. They're probably thinking, okay, what's profit? Well, Solomon, look at you. Look at your profit. You've built the temple. You've built numerous cities and structures. You've accumulated all this wealth. You've got a lot of women. Whatever. And they're probably looking around and seeing what they think to be the success. And they probably even think this is probably where he's going with this. Look at the success of life, right? But he's going the exact opposite direction. He says, "What profit hath a man for his labor under the sun?" You ask that question today, what would people say? You know, it's interesting. I don't think the answers would differ much today than they would back then, right? Ask yourself that question right now. What are you hoping to gain from your labor under the sun, from your work while you're here on earth? It's a good question to ask, right? What do you hope to gain? Some might say, well, I work to gain money, to support my family, to feed my family, to pay the bills, and to hopefully save enough to enjoy some type of pleasures now and then. I work to gain position, power in my company. I work to gain respect. I work to gain relationships with people. I work to gain pleasure. I work to gain, and you fill in the blank. We've all got what we work for, right? We've got our purposes. We've got our reasons for why we work and why we do what we do. It's a great question to ask ourselves. What profit is our work here on earth? So he leads with this question. And as the Lord allows, we will spend the following messages in this series specifically answering this thesis statement or question. Obviously, we are dealing with here initially a message of despair. An admonition from the wisest man to ever live to wake up, right? Some of us here are young. You've got all kinds of plans. You're in high school, you're in college, you're young married, whatever. Just starting your career, you've got all kinds of plans, don't you? I can say that because I'm right there. We've got all our plans. We've got everything laid out for what we want to do, what we hope to accomplish. And we have this goal in mind that once I reach that, there it is. That's what I need. That's what I want. There are some here in the middle of your journey of labor. You started out. You're in the process of it. You work hard every day. What are your goals right now? What are you working for? There are some here on the back end of that journey. You've come through life, perhaps disappointed with your level of success. Perhaps you enjoyed and actually achieved all of the things you endeavored to do. I ask you this, to what end? That's where Solomon is at right now. He's writing this most likely at the end, towards the end of his life. He's on the back end of life now. And he all of a sudden realizes, to what end was I doing all of this? To what end are you really working for? We all have our goals. I remember as a kid, goals were pretty simple back then. Buy this toy, run outside, have fun, go through school as quickly as possible. As a homeschooler, you can do that. Goals were simple. As you get older, goals get a little bigger, don't they? You start getting into junior high, and you cannot wait till you get to high school, right? Enjoy life a little bit more. People in high school always seem to be enjoying life a whole lot more than I am, so I want to be in high school. As soon as you get to high school, you get towards the back end of high school, and you're like, I'm ready for college now. What I need is to get out of the house. I got to get out of the house. I got to get out of my town, And so that's your goal as a college student, right? Or as a future college student. You're going to get to college. As soon as you get to college, you say, wow, this is not what I thought it was supposed to be. And so you get through college and you think, okay, well, I'm going to pick my major. I'm going to pick whatever career I want to do and what I think will get me the most money, that will achieve my personal goals as much as they can. And so you stick through it, hopefully, right? You get through college, and then you decide what's next. Some might go on to master's programs. Others might go straight into work. You have your goals laid out. And what do? We look to what's next, don't we? And as soon as we get there, what do we want next? What's next? So you graduate from college, and you get your dream job. And you think, that's what I needed. I needed my dream job. Now what? Okay, I got my dream job. I'm pretty happy for about a month or two. Now I want that extra promotion now. And your goal probably through the majority of your work career is hoping to gain power and position in your work maybe. You say, as long as I can build my savings here, my savings there, as long as I can succeed, then I will have it. I will feel like I've made it. I've achieved my goals. And as soon as you get to those goals, what do you want? I want retirement now. Give me retirement. I'm going to enjoy life finally. You get to retirement and you say, this is it. I don't like it. What's going on? This wasn't everything I was promised I would get. And we all do this. Even in the ministry we do this. We have our goals, don't we? I have my goals for my ministry. I have this, that. To what end? Who am I really serving? Who am I working for? Is it myself? Personal gain? Do I envy what others have and think, if my ministry could be here, then I would be there. I would arrive. My goal has been achieved. Then we reach there and we're not quite satisfied. Where are we finding our satisfactions? When I was in my master's program at Bob Jones, studying for biblical counseling, one of my classes, I think it was crisis counseling, the professor talked about the way to despair. This is what we're talking about, right? Despair. How do we arrive at the point of despair in life? How do you get there? You know where it begins? It begins with dissatisfaction. It's the things we're chasing, right? You're not satisfied with your current position. You chase whatever you're dissatisfied about, right? You arrive there, and what happens? Satisfaction fulfilled, hole plugged, new one opens over here. So you follow that dissatisfaction. You fulfill that. What happens partway through life is you start realizing, wow, this isn't everything it was cracked up to be. And chances are you start slipping into anxiety after dissatisfaction, right? And anxiety eventually gives way to where we find Solomon right here at despair. As we study through Ecclesiastes in the months to come, I want us to use this book kind of as a tool for revealing our dissatisfactions in life. That's the goal for what Solomon is trying to do here. He lists many, many things, many areas of life calling them vanity. And it's a great tool for us to use as we read through it, as we study through it, to examine our own hearts, to reveal where our dissatisfactions are. Solomon was a man that undoubtedly we can listen and believe because he had great authority. He had great power. He did what nobody else could achieve. He is the Bill Gates of that time. He's greater than Bill Gates. He had everything. He's a man that knows what he's talking about. And it hit him, probably much later in life than he wished it did. It hit him that everything around him, what he was working so hard for, fulfilling the pleasures of life, chasing after them, it hit him that they're all going to be gone. Tell me this, what is left of Solomon's achievements? All the things that we went through in his life, that he achieved, that he built, that he accumulated unto himself, where are they all now? Who knows? Most of it has disintegrated. Whatever's left is, the walls maybe that he built. I actually just read somewhere that some Solomonic walls have actually just been discovered. I saw a picture. They look pretty weak right now. Compared to modern technology, they're nothing now. Nothing that he accomplished from a worldly standpoint lasts today. That's what he's getting at. Don't be deceived by flesh-driven ideals and goals that will ultimately return to dust. Don't waste your life. Remember what brought Solomon to this point. He failed to obey God. He had it right in front of him. It said, basically, Solomon, don't accumulate all these things. He ignored it. He's enamored with what he saw and what his flesh wanted, and he was convinced that if he just chased it and fulfilled it, and he knew he could, he had the wisdom, he had the power, he had the talent, he could do it. And he chased it. He was deceived, even in his great wisdom. This is a question a message that we've heard several times before, but how often are we reminding ourselves of it? If we're not constantly reminding ourselves of it, I guarantee you, you're slipping probably back into the chase the dissatisfaction mode, because that's what's natural. That's what we want. We must constantly be reminding ourselves of what we're doing. What is the gain of my labor here on earth? Most of you know I am a pretty hardcore Yankees fan. And I hope I just didn't discredit everything I just said, preached on just by saying that. So if you're not a fan, just bear with me, okay? I love you, promise. If you're a Yankees fan or just a baseball fan, you know who Mickey Mantle is. One of the greatest baseball players to ever play the game. 536 career home runs, a world record, 18 World Series. He's an awesome player. One of the best. And I came across an article the other day from a man that actually was able to interview Mickey Mantle towards the end of his life. And he records some interesting things here. Apparently he went in, Mickey Mantle was not doing well physically. He was in his bed at the hospital. And so he sat up and agreed to do an interview. And he began by talking about how lucky he was to have achieved so much in baseball, how blessed he was to have such loyal fans and all the success that baseball had brought him. And the author, the writer of this, records how ironic it was as he was saying all this that his ring on his finger was almost falling off because he was so frail and so thin. The watch on his wristwatch was no longer on his wrist. It was halfway up his arm because he'd gotten so thin from his sickness. And behind him, he had all these great pictures of him in uniform, swinging a bat, powerful, strong. He was a shadow of that. Mickey said, "I owe so much to my family, to God, and to the American people for accepting me as they have, for being such great fans." And then he began to choke up, I guess, after this. He was skeletal, he was pale, he lost 40 pounds. And he went on to talk about his regrets. As he called it, a life of internal hell. A life he had squandered by chasing after whatever he desired. And in his case, one of the things he desired most was alcohol. He chased those desires, and he expresses his regret on it. He was on to tell the writers, his admirers, and the world that he is no role model. Just a guy who was given a gift, a guy who was blessed, and he says, and tortured at the same time. He said, God gave me the ability to play baseball. God gave me everything, but for the kids out there, don't be like me. With great regret and sadness in his voice, he spoke very apologetically. He said, all you've got to do is look at me to see it's wasted. And he said this as tears began to well up in his eyes. One of the greatest baseball players to ever play the game, enjoyed amazing success at what he did. And he says, it's all a waste. He went on to say, all I want to do with the rest of my life is give back because all I ever did was take. He died 4 weeks later. Sad. Story of one of the greatest baseball players to ever play the game. What are you chasing after? What is it that we labor so hard for under the sun day after day after day? Don't live your life like Solomon, chasing your dissatisfaction, because a life lived for the satisfaction of the flesh will only ever end in despair. Would you bow with me and pray?